It was a quiet night in Kansas, the kind of night where the only sound you could hear was the soft rustling of the trees as the wind whispered through their leaves. Echo Ridge, a small town nestled in the heart of the state, had always been the picture of peace and simplicity. People went about their daily lives without worry, content in the tranquility that surrounded them. But tonight, the wind seemed different. Its whispers carried something darker, something unsettling. At first, the strange disappearances were subtle. One person here, another there, vanishing without a trace. The town's residents couldn't quite put their finger on it. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, they thought. Maybe it was just the result of people moving away, or perhaps there had been some unfortunate run-ins with the wrong crowd. After all, Echo Ridge had always been quiet, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping away unnoticed, especially in such a tight-knit community. The first disappearance that truly caught everyone's attention was that of Karen, the local baker. She'd lived in Echo Ridge for decades, known by everyone in town, always ready with a warm smile and a loaf of freshly baked bread. When Karen failed to show up at the bakery one morning, it seemed a little odd, but no one thought much of it. Maybe she was just feeling under the weather. The next day, however, her shop was still locked, and Karen's house was empty, save for her purse lying on the kitchen table. It wasn't like Karen to leave without a word, especially not without her purse. By the time the third person had disappeared, the town's calm demeanor had started to waver. It was too much of a coincidence now. The missing were always people who had no real enemies, who had never been known to run off or even quarrel with anyone. That's when the rumors started. Some whispered that perhaps there was something going on at the old, abandoned farmhouse at the edge of town. Others believed it was a string of robberies, masked by disappearances, orchestrated by some unseen thief. But as more people started to vanish, people like George, the elderly man who owned the local hardware store, and Patricia, the young mother who ran the daycare, the whispers grew louder. The town could no longer deny it. There was something wrong, something far beyond what they could explain. Sheriff David Harris was the first to truly raise the alarm. He was the steady, calm presence in Echo Ridge, the one everyone turned to in times of crisis. He'd seen the disappearances, heard the whispers, and knew that something had to be done. David was a man of reason, never one to jump to conclusions. He spent the next few days working tirelessly, tracking down leads, checking records, and investigating every possible theory. But each time, he came up empty-handed. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no witnesses. It was as if the missing people had simply vanished into thin air. David was starting to feel the pressure. The town's anxiety was palpable, and people were beginning to lose faith in him. The first break came when the town's doctor, Dr. Marcus Phillips, reported something strange. A woman had come into his office, claiming that she had seen something the night Karen disappeared. At first, she'd seemed almost too hysterical to take seriously. But Dr. Phillips, knowing the woman well, decided to listen. The woman, Sarah Keller, was an old friend of Karen's, and she'd been walking home from a late shift at the hospital when she saw a figure moving in the darkness near Karen's house. She described the figure as tall and shadowy, almost like a person, but not quite. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, as if it were more part of the night than anything solid. She couldn't make out any details, but she was sure that it wasn't human. The description sent a chill down David's spine. The idea of someone lurking in the shadows, taking people in the night, made his stomach turn. But what could it be? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the idea of a person vanishing into thin air was becoming less and less plausible. The only thing that made sense now was that something or someone was behind the disappearances, and it wasn't human. David shared the information with the town's elders, the people who had lived in Echo Ridge their entire lives. They told him the story of a curse, an old legend that had been passed down through generations. They spoke of a figure known as the Killer of Kansas, a mysterious person who had supposedly been responsible for a string of gruesome murders long ago. The legend had been dismissed by most as mere folklore, but the elders were adamant. They said that the killer had disappeared years ago, but his spirit was said to haunt the town. If the town had truly come under his curse, they feared no one was safe. At first, David laughed off the story. He was a man of logic, not superstition. But as the disappearances continued, the idea of a ghostly figure, or worse, a killer, lurking in the shadows, began to take root in his mind. What if there was something to the legend? What if, just maybe, the town's past had come back to haunt them? The more he thought about it, the more unsettling the idea became. Then, one night, it happened. The sheriff, too, vanished. It wasn't just that David had disappeared without a trace. There were no signs, no clues, no anything to tell where he had gone. One moment, he was at his desk, scribbling notes in his notebook, and the next, he was gone. His office was locked, and his car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The town was in full-blown panic mode. The disappearance of Sheriff David Harris was the last straw. No one in Echo Ridge could pretend anymore that this was just a case of people leaving town or some series of unfortunate events. The people had been right all along. Something was happening. Something horrible. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface of the small town finally boiled over. People whispered in hushed tones, wondering if the killer, or the ghost, or whatever force was behind the disappearances, was out there still. No one was sure what was happening, but the rumors that had once seemed absurd now seemed all too real. Echo Ridge was no longer a peaceful town. It had become a place where darkness reigned, and where no one was safe. Something was terribly wrong in Kansas, and no one knew how to stop it. It was a cold, damp evening when the first real clue emerged. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, as the town of Echo Ridge seemed to hold its breath. The streets were quiet, the usual sounds of the small town hushed by the chill of the night. A farmer named Henry Reynolds, known for his early morning shifts and long days tending to his cattle, was walking back to his barn after finishing up his chores. It had been a long day, and the last thing he expected was to find something that would turn the already tense atmosphere of Echo Ridge into one of full-blown terror. As he neared the old creek that ran near the edge of his property, he spotted something strange in the grass. At first, it seemed like a shadow, but the closer he got, the clearer it became. Lying, partially hidden by the overgrown weeds, was a small piece of cloth. At first, Henry thought it was just some scrap from one of his farm hands' uniforms, perhaps ripped off during a day of hard work. But as he bent down to inspect it more closely, the sight stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't just any cloth. This was a part of a uniform. A sheriff's uniform. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the dark blue fabric and the faint outline of a silver badge emblem, still visible on the torn cloth. It was unmistakable. The uniform belonged to Sheriff David Harris, the man who had been leading the investigation into the recent disappearances. The same man who had vanished just days ago without a trace. The cloth was stained with something dark, something unmistakable, blood. Panic surged through Henry's veins as he stood frozen for a moment. The quiet night that had felt so still now seemed charged with an ominous energy. Without thinking, he grabbed the cloth and rushed back to his house. His hands shook as he knocked urgently on the door, waking his wife, Linda, who had been asleep. She could see the terror on his face. "What is it, Henry?" she asked, her voice groggy with sleep, but instantly concerned. Henry held out the blood-stained cloth. "It's David's. I found it by the creek, just like that. Something's happened to him, Linda. This is bad." Her face drained of color as she took the cloth from him, her eyes widening with disbelief. The symbol of law in Echo Ridge, the sheriff's badge, was stained with blood. David's blood, perhaps. The reality of it settled in quickly. A chilling thought that had been at the back of everyone's mind, but was too terrifying to truly confront. The sheriff, the one man who had been trying to hold the community together in the wake of the disappearances, had somehow become part of the mystery. Henry didn't waste any time. He knew he had to show this to someone who could make sense of it. Without a word, he grabbed his jacket and left, heading straight to the town's main gathering spot. The diner. Linda stayed behind, holding the cloth tightly in her hands, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The diner was a few blocks away, a small, warm building where the locals often gathered to share news and gossip. By the time Henry arrived, the place was buzzing with activity. The disappearances had become the main topic of conversation, and the regular crowd seemed on edge. But when Henry walked through the door, the chatter stopped. Everyone turned to look at him, sensing that something had changed. Henry's face was pale, his eyes wide with alarm. He approached the counter, where Sarah, the waitress, stood. "Henry, what is it?" Sarah asked, already sensing something was wrong. Henry barely spoke a word as he held out the cloth. Her hands trembled as she took it from him. She didn't need to ask any questions. She recognized it immediately. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The room was dead silent now, everyone waiting for some kind of explanation. "Where did you find this?" asked Tom, the local mechanic, his voice shaking. He'd been friends with David for years. "By the creek, near the Reynolds farm," Henry said, his voice tight. "It's David's. It's blood-stained, just like this." Fear swept through the diner like wildfire. The room was filled with the low murmur of panic as everyone began to whisper among themselves. There were no words for what this meant, only the understanding that something much darker was happening than anyone could have imagined. "David's gone. He's dead, isn't he?" someone muttered from the back. It was a harsh, blunt statement, but it resonated with the growing fear that had been festering in the town for weeks. The sheriff, the symbol of protection and order in the small town, was no longer in the picture. And now, but what was even more terrifying was the realization that the legend they had all laughed off, the one about the Kansas killer, might not be just a story anymore. The mysterious figure that had haunted the state's folklore for decades, who is said to be responsible for a string of brutal, unsolved murders, was somehow tied to the disappearance of the sheriff. The locals had always joked about it. Over the years, the legend had become little more than a ghost story told around campfires. They had dismissed the stories of a dark figure roaming the plains, taking lives without leaving a trace. People thought it was just an old tale to scare children, something to add to the spooky atmosphere of the rural landscape. But now, with the blood-stained cloth in hand, that story didn't feel so much like fiction anymore. Henry was the one to break the silence in the diner. "We need to do something," he said, his voice strong despite the tremor in his hands. "The sheriff's gone, and I'm not waiting around to find out who's next. We have to get to the bottom of this." Everyone agreed. The time for dismissing it as coincidence had passed. The fear that had been simmering under the surface of Echo Ridge for weeks had turned into something tangible, something real. The town wasn't just dealing with a series of random disappearances anymore. It was facing something far more terrifying. As the night stretched on, the conversation in the diner grew more frantic. People had questions that no one could answer, fears that no one could assuage. Was the Kansas killer real? Had he returned after all these years? Or was there something else at work here? Something even darker, something that no one could possibly understand. The only thing they knew for sure was that Echo Ridge was no longer the quiet, peaceful town it once had been. It was now a place of fear, uncertainty, and darkness. A place where the line between myth and reality had blurred, and the whispers of the past had returned with a vengeance. And no one was safe. Long ago, in the early 1900s, the plains of Kansas were far from the peaceful, quiet backdrop they appeared to be. The winds that swept across the flat landscape carried not only the sounds of rustling grass and distant thunder, but also whispers of something darker. People spoke of a figure known only as the Killer of Kansas. His real name? No one knew. His face? Only a blur in the memories of the few survivors who had encountered him. The stories of his reign of terror had become more folklore than fact, passed down through generations of Kansans who had long. The tales told of a man, or perhaps a creature, who roamed the Kansas plains in the dead of night, seeking out victims with an unnatural quiet. He was described as tall, with a presence so foreboding that even the bravest of men would shrink away in fear when his name was mentioned. He would appear from nowhere, his dark figure emerging like a shadow from the endless fields. No one knew where he came from or where he went, but he always left behind one unmistakable sign: death. His victims were never found alive. They would vanish, often without a trace, and when their bodies were discovered, they were always found in the most gruesome of conditions. Some of them had been mutilated beyond recognition, their bodies discarded like refuse in the tall grass. Others had their throats slashed with surgical precision, and still others were simply gone, their lives snuffed out without explanation. The people of Kansas, after a few brutal years of fear, had come to the unsettling conclusion that the killer was nothing more than a ghost. A name that parents used to scare their children. A tale to explain the inexplicable. The killer's reign seemed to have ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Some said that he was caught, others that he had simply disappeared. But over time, the memories faded, and the fear settled into the background, becoming part of the state's history, a dusty story told around campfires and at local bars. But now, as disappearances once again began to plague Echo Ridge, the old stories resurfaced with terrifying clarity. It wasn't long before the residents of the small town began to ask themselves questions they'd long buried in the back of their minds. Could it really be him? Was the killer of Kansas, the infamous ghost of the plains, back to claim more victims? The possibility seemed absurd at first. After all, the tales were just that, tales, myths. But with each new disappearance, the line between myth and reality began to blur, and the unease in the town grew stronger. The stories of the killer were never specific about his motives, only that he seemed driven by a chilling need for death. His victims were always random, and he left no pattern, no clues, nothing that would give anyone a sense of why he chose the people he did. It was as though he was simply a force of nature, relentless, cold, and inevitable. And the most terrifying part of all was that no one ever saw him coming. He was like a shadow, a silent killer who could strike at any time and disappear just as quickly, leaving only fear and blood in his wake. As more and more people went missing, the air in Echo Ridge grew thick with fear. At first, the disappearances were easy to dismiss as coincidence or perhaps the work of some unknown criminal. But when the town sheriff, David Harris, vanished too, the cracks in the town's collective denial began to show. The sheriff, the one man who had always stood at the forefront of any crisis in Echo Ridge, had always been the voice of reason. He'd seen it all. The occasional theft, the drunken brawls, the small town troubles that never seemed to stop. But this was different. This wasn't just a case of missing people. This was something much darker. The people of Echo Ridge couldn't ignore it anymore. They began to whisper among themselves, remembering the old stories, the tales their grandparents had told them about the killer of Kansas. Some dismissed it as nothing more than superstition, but others couldn't shake the feeling that they were living through a nightmare that had been set in motion long ago. The townspeople grew fearful, not just of the disappearances, but of the very idea that the killer, the legendary figure from the past, might be among them again. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some said the killer had never truly left, that he had simply gone into hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. Others claimed he was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance that haunted the plains, choosing its victims at random. And then there were the more practical minds, who believed that perhaps the killer was simply a man, a very disturbed, very dangerous man, who had somehow survived the years, slipping through the cracks of society and waiting for the right time to strike again. The fear began to consume the town. People started locking their doors earlier in the evening, checking their windows and looking over their shoulders when walking down the street. No one felt safe anymore, and even the bravest among them couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows that once seemed innocent now carried an ominous weight, and the wind that rustled through the trees at night felt more like a warning than a simple breeze. The town was now gripped by a terror that had nothing to do with thieves or burglars. This was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been lurking in the shadows of Kansas for decades. The people of Echo Ridge were left to wonder, could the killer really be back? Was he still out there, waiting for the right moment to claim more lives? Could it be that this was all part of some dark, twisted fate that Kansas had been living with for far too long? The fear in the air was so thick you could almost taste it. It wasn't just fear for the next victim. It was fear of the unknown. People began to wonder how far the killer's reach went. Had he always been there, hiding just beyond the veil of normalcy, waiting for his chance to strike again? Or had the old curse of Kansas somehow woken up, bringing with it the shadow of death that had once terrorized the state? The townspeople no longer knew what to believe. All they knew was that something was terribly wrong. And as the fear grew, so did the whispers of the killer's return. The people of Echo Ridge were no longer just worried about the missing. They were terrified that they were living in the midst of something far more sinister. The killer of Kansas, the one who had haunted the plains for decades, might very well be walking among them once again. And the only question that remained was this: who would be next? The night was thick with an uneasy stillness as a group of teenagers gathered at the edge of the woods on the outskirts of Echo Ridge. Their decision had been made earlier that day. They weren't going to sit idly by while their town was gripped by fear and confusion. They weren't going to wait for someone else to uncover the truth. They were going to do it themselves, armed with nothing but flashlights, their unrelenting curiosity, and perhaps a little too much courage. They set off towards the place where it all began, the creek where the sheriff's uniform had been found. The air felt heavier as they walked deeper into the woods, the trees stretching above them like looming giants, their branches tangled together in eerie patterns. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and only the occasional flicker of their flashlights illuminated the path ahead. Each step they took seemed to echo in the stillness, the weight of the moment pressing on their shoulders. The tension was palpable. Thick, like the fog that rolled in from the nearby plains. The woods around them felt alive, as though they were watching, waiting, and listening. They didn't speak much as they ventured further into the darkness. What was there to say? The disappearance of the sheriff, the blood-stained cloth, the whispers of a killer. Each of them had heard the stories. Each had felt the fear that was slowly taking over the town. But tonight, they were determined to find something that would put an end to the terrifying mystery. They wanted answers. They needed to know if the killer from the old legend had truly returned, or if the town was being consumed by its own paranoia. The trees grew denser as they approached the creek. The sound of the water trickling over the rocks was the only thing that broke the silence. They had arrived at the spot where Henry Reynolds had found the sheriff's uniform, the place that had sent shockwaves through the town. The air here felt colder somehow, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. The teens stood in a tight group. Then, as they took a few more steps toward the creek, a soft, barely audible whisper reached their ears. It was faint at first, like the rustling of the leaves in the wind, but it quickly grew clearer. "Help me." The voice was thin, desperate, and full of fear. It was so quiet that they almost thought it was their imaginations playing tricks on them. But the words seemed to hang in the air, chilling them to the bone. The teens froze in place, their hearts thundering in their chests. They turned to look at each other, wide-eyed, but no one had the courage to speak. What was that? Who had said those words? And why did it feel as though the very earth beneath them was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? They stood there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity. The only sound, the wind moving through the trees, and the faint rustling of leaves at their feet. But there was no movement, no sign of another soul, no footsteps, no distant voices. The clearing ahead was empty, save for the flickering glow of their flashlights. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the distance, shrouded in darkness. The teens blinked, unsure if their minds were playing tricks on them. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the light. But as they stared, the figure grew clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form cloaked in a black, tattered robe that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure stood still, just beyond the reach of their flashlights, watching them. But it wasn't just its silhouette that was terrifying. It was the eyes. There, in the darkness, the figure's eyes glowed faintly. A sickly, unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the night. They were bright, almost as though they were alive, burning with an eerie intensity. The teens couldn't look away. It was as though the eyes were pulling them in, paralyzing them with a sense of dread they couldn't explain. Time seemed to stand still as they all stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to speak. They had heard the stories, the warnings. Everyone had. But this was real. This was the thing that had haunted the town for generations. The very killer they had been so desperate to uncover. It wasn't a myth, not anymore. The figure in front of them was more than just a ghost or a legend. It was something far worse. It was the killer of Kansas. Panic surged through them, and in an instant, everything changed. The teens bolted into action, their legs moving faster than they ever thought possible. Their flashlights bounced wildly as they ran, fear flooding their senses, drowning out every rational thought. The sounds of their footsteps were loud in the silence, the pounding of their hearts louder than the rushing wind. They didn't look back, not once, as they sprinted through the woods, fear driving them forward, pushing them faster than they had ever run before. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. It was as if the figure was right behind them, moving as swiftly and silently as the wind itself. The rustling of the leaves grew louder, the whisper of their own breathing drowned by the pounding of their feet against the ground. The cold air seemed to press in from all sides, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Finally, after what felt like hours, they burst out of the woods and onto the main road. The familiar glow of the streetlights in the distance was a beacon of safety, a sign that they had escaped the darkness. They kept running, not stopping until they reached the safety of the town, panting and out of breath. As they collapsed in the middle of the street, gasping for air, they turned to look at each other, their faces pale with terror. They couldn't speak at first. What had they seen? What had they experienced? Was it really the killer, or had it all been a figment of their imagination, the result of fear and the stories they had heard? The answer was clear in their eyes. They had seen him. The killer of Kansas had returned, and now they knew that no one was safe. The town of Echo Ridge had slipped into a state of full-blown panic. It wasn't just the strange disappearances anymore. It wasn't just the ominous whispers that seemed to seep into every corner of town. No, this time it was personal. The killer of Kansas, had been spotted again, and he was no longer just a ghost story, a myth whispered about in hushed voices. He was real, and he had returned to claim more lives. The streets, once familiar and full of life, now felt heavy with dread. Everyone had heard the tales, and now they could see the truth before them. The killer had returned, and he wasn't just lurking in the shadows anymore. He was hunting. As the town sat on the edge of despair, a group of brave men and women decided that they couldn't hide in fear any longer. They had to confront the darkness head on. No more waiting, no more running. A handful of townsfolk gathered in the middle of the night, their faces determined and their eyes hard with resolve. There were no heroic speeches, no bravado, just a collective understanding that they had to end this once and for all. They grabbed whatever they could find, a couple of guns from the local gun shop, axes from the old lumber mill, and even a few torches to light their way through the suffocating darkness. They weren't experts in fighting, but they were ready to give it everything they had. The legend of the killer had plagued their town for far too long, and they weren't about to let it claim any more lives. With heavy hearts and minds filled with fear, they set out into the forest, where the killer was last seen. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a ghostly glow over the thick trees. The woods were no longer a peaceful sanctuary. They were the very place where the darkness had taken root, where people had vanished, never to be seen again. Every crack of a twig beneath their boots, every rustle of the leaves above their heads, felt like an omen. The air was cold, biting with the sharpness of fear, but they didn't stop. The deeper they walked into the woods, the more the weight of the silence pressed down on them. There was no wind, no sound of animals. It was as if the very forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was out there, hidden in the darkness. But there was no turning back now. The fate of their town rested in their hands. As they reached the creek, the very place where Sheriff David Harris's uniform had been found, everything stopped. The atmosphere shifted, the stillness turning oppressive. The air crackled with tension, as if the earth itself was aware of their presence. And then they saw him. There, standing by the water's edge, was the figure they had feared, the killer. He stood in the shadows, just out of the reach of their torches' light, his outline barely visible. He was tall, towering over them in a way that was unnatural. His cloak, a tattered mass of black, fluttered like it had a life of its own, as if the wind itself was afraid to touch him. His face was obscured by the darkness, but the aura around him was undeniable. There was something wrong about him, something that didn't feel human. His presence radiated malice, a coldness that seeped into their bones and twisted in their hearts. The townsfolk froze for a moment. The figure did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, watching them. The sound of the water rushing by was the only thing that broke the oppressive silence. And then, with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the killer spoke. "You should not have come. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The words hung in the air like poison, seeping into their thoughts, their very souls. They could feel it. The killer wasn't just some maniacal murderer. He was something more, something darker, something that had transcended human understanding. One of the men, John Weaver, the local blacksmith, stepped forward. His hands shook, but his voice was steady as the figure did not move. But his eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, focused on John. The men and women around John stood still, their eyes fixed on the killer, their hearts pounding in their chests. The tension was unbearable, thick like the night itself. Suddenly, the killer moved, faster than they could see, and it was like the entire forest shifted with him. In an instant, he was upon them, his form dissolving into the shadows, blending with the night like a ghost. The torches flickered and threatened to go out, but the air was thick with the energy of the struggle. The townsfolk fought back with everything they had, swinging their axes, firing their guns, but nothing touched him. He moved with an unnatural speed, his body contorting in ways that defied logic, slipping between strikes with ease. Every attempt to land a blow was met with swift, chilling retaliation. The battle that followed was chaos. Screams of terror and pain filled the air as the townsfolk fought for their lives. The sounds of metal clashing with bone, the crack of gunfire, and the howls of terror echoed through the woods. It was a nightmare come to life. They had all known that this was going to be dangerous, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer evil that they were up against. It was like fighting a force of nature, something unstoppable, something that didn't bleed, didn't tire. The killer was everywhere and nowhere, his presence like a shadow that spread across the battlefield. The townsfolk fought with desperation, but they were outmatched. The killer was more than just a man. He was something far worse, something ancient, something that had lived through the years and bided its time. The forest seemed to close in around them. Every path, every direction felt like a dead end. The killer moved with supernatural grace, his form darting between the trees, his eyes glowing with malice, always just out of reach. No matter how hard they tried to push back, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the killer stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the quiet they had known before. It was a stillness so thick it was suffocating. The killer was gone, leaving only the echo of his presence behind. The townsfolk stood there, gasping for breath, their bodies bruised and bloodied, their minds reeling from the horror they had just experienced. The forest was silent, too silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It wasn't over. They knew that. But for the first time, they had fought back. They had faced the darkness, and they had survived, for now. By the time the sun began to rise over Echo Ridge, the small town was forever changed. The sky, once painted in hues of dark blue and black, was now bleeding shades of crimson and gold. But the dawn didn't bring the sense of relief that it normally would. It didn't erase the terror of the previous night. In fact, it only served as a reminder that something had shifted. The sun rose over a town that would never be the same again. The killer was gone. At least, that's what the survivors thought. But the price of facing him had been steep. The brave men and women who had ventured into the forest to confront the darkness, to face the horrors that had haunted their town for so long, were now gone. Some were found, their bodies battered and broken, scattered throughout the woods where they had fought. But others, most others, were never found at all. They had disappeared into the night, just like the others before them. The people of Echo Ridge were left to grapple with the truth of what had happened. No one knew for sure what had happened to the missing townsfolk. Some believed they had simply vanished into the same dark force that had taken so many others. Others whispered that they had been taken by the curse that had long haunted Kansas. A curse that had its roots buried deep in the history of the state, far older and darker than any of them could understand. The legends of the killer of Kansas had always been dismissed as myths, ghost stories meant to keep children in line. But now, in the wake of that night, those same stories no longer felt so far-fetched. The curse, whatever it was, had claimed more than just lives. It had claimed the soul of Echo Ridge itself. The town was no longer just a place on a map. It was a shadow of what it once was. The once thriving streets were now eerily quiet, the houses abandoned or left in disrepair. The laughter that once filled the air was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of fear. Even those who had survived the killer's wrath couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed deep within the heart of their town. But the killer's departure didn't mean the end of the terror. No, the true horror of Kansas was far from over. The curse that had plagued the land for so long was far from finished. It wasn't just about a man or a killer. It was about something older, something more primal, something that had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. Now, when you drive through Kansas at night, you might notice it. The quiet hum of the road beneath your tires, the flickering of the streetlights as you pass by, the shadow of something standing at the edge of the road. It's easy to dismiss it as your imagination, or the trick of a tired mind. But if you look closely enough, you might catch a glimpse of something you weren't meant to see. A figure standing motionless in the dark, the glint of eyes faintly glowing in the moonlight. It could be anyone who has been touched by the curse of Kansas, anyone who has dared to venture too close to the darkness that still lingers in the air. The wind, which has always been a part of Kansas, now carries a different kind of whisper. It's a voice, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable if you listen closely enough. Help me. The voice comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. It could be the wind playing tricks, or it could be something else. Something far darker. The curse has a way of finding those who aren't looking for it. It slips into your mind when you least expect it. Wraps around your thoughts like a vine and pulls you into the shadows. It's a warning, and yet it's an invitation. The killer may be gone, but the curse is not finished. The land itself seems to carry the weight of those lost to it, their souls trapped, never able to find peace. The people of Echo Ridge, who have vanished, have become part of the curse, just like those who came before them. It's as if the land has absorbed them, their spirit. And so, the curse of Kansas continues, as it always has. The killer's presence may not be as tangible as it once was, but his legacy lives on, threaded through the very soil of the state. If you travel through Kansas in the dead of night, you might find yourself slowing down near the forests, near the creeks. You'll feel the weight of history pressing down on you, the stories of the past creeping into your mind. You'll wonder if the road you're on will be the one that leads you to safety, or if it's the one that will pull you into the darkness, just like so many before you. As the years go by, the legend of the killer will continue to haunt Kansas. People will talk about it in whispers, telling stories to their children, warnings that are meant to keep them from going too far, from venturing too deep into the woods. But like all legends, it will become harder to tell fact from fiction, and the curse will continue to grow quietly in the background, a shadow over the land that no one can escape. The true horror isn't just the killer, it's the unknown forces that continue to haunt Kansas to this day. It's the dark history, the lingering presence of those who were lost, their voices carried on the wind, their eyes glowing in the distance. It's the land itself, forever cursed, forever tied to the darkness that waits just beyond the edge of the road. So, what do you think? Is the killer still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim to stumble upon him? Or has the curse of Kansas passed on to those who dared to uncover the truth, their souls forever bound to the land? The answer is unclear, but one thing is certain. The darkness that haunts Kansas has not been extinguished. It's still there, waiting, watching, and it's only a matter of time before it finds its next victim. Keep your eyes open, because you never know when the darkness will find you.